They say there are corners of Northern Appalachia where you still shouldn't speak certain names aloud. Not because the land is dangerous, but because memory itself carries its own kind of caution. In those valleys, the older ones don't tell children fairy tales. They tell them warnings, warnings shaped by a year most families have tried to forget. A year when the mountains kept whispering after sundown. A year when people closed their doors long before nightfall, even if the lamps were still burning bright inside. Ask anyone who lived through that time, and you'll see it in their eyes. A hesitance, a pause, a moment where they weigh whether retelling the story is worth stirring something they spent decades pushing out of their thoughts. They remember 1974, the way a person remembers a night they almost didn't survive. And though most of them refuse to speak of the figure who haunted their ridgeline, every settlement near the Northern Trail knows the same truth. There was once someone or something that moved through those woods with purpose. The tale was never written down, not in journals, not in ledgers, not in any family record. Those who witnessed it made sure of that. They believed the next generation deserved an easier life, one free of the thing that lived among the pines, long enough to reshape the way entire communities slept, traveled, and prayed. But the land has a long memory, and when the cold winds bend through the hollows, folks say the air carries traces of a year, when everything those mountains had endured finally gave way. And it all circles back to one figure, one presence from 1974, known only in hushed conversations as the predator too evil for the history books. Back in those days, Northern Appalachia lived by its own rhythm. The roads were fewer, the paths were narrow, and the forest pressed close on all sides, as if guarding the secrets of the families tucked deep within its folds. Settlements sat miles apart, often connected by nothing more than worn foot trails carved long before automobiles reached those hills. Life moved carefully there, shaped by weather, tradition, and the quiet understanding that isolation could either shelter you or consume you. Winters were long, the kind that pushed smoke through chimneys for months. Summers carried a heat that settled between the trees, making the woods feel older than they already were. People rose early, rested early, and trusted only those they'd known for generations. Every household had stories of storms survived, paths memorized, and animals that wandered too close at night. But among all those tales, one family's name carried more weight than the rest. Their homestead rested at the far edge of the ridge, nearly swallowed by the forest's shadow. They rarely came into town, and when they did, people kept their distance, not out of anger, but out of a quiet, unspoken understanding. They had lived there longer than anyone could trace, longer than census records reached, longer than the oldest graves in the valley. Each generation of that bloodline kept to their land, rarely inviting visitors, rarely stepping beyond the tree line unless necessity demanded it. Those who grew up in the area knew the warnings from childhood. Don't wander past their boundary fence. Don't follow sounds toward their direction. Don't go near their land at dusk. And these were not warnings given out of spite. They were given with care, with the kind of seriousness born from memories parents wished their children would never inherit. Yet despite all this caution, people in the surrounding settlements understood something important. Whatever lived within that family's walls was changing. Slowly, quietly, year after year. The land around them held its breath. And by the time 1974 approached, many sensed the ridge was bracing for something it had no words for. If you had been living in those hills during that time, before the roads were widened, before the valleys filled with newcomers, you would have felt the weight of those unspoken rules too. People didn't need to explain them. They lived them. They honored them. And children understood early that curiosity carried a price in those mountains. Picture yourself walking those paths as a local. The tree line would rise on both sides of you, tall and watchful, branches stretching overhead like a second sky. The air would be quiet in a way that made every footstep sound louder than it should. And somewhere in the distance, you might hear the faint echo of movement. Nothing alarming, just a reminder that the forest had its own occupants. Some familiar, some not. Now imagine raising a family there. Would you let your children wander near that ridge on their own? Would you trust the woods to keep them safe if they strayed too far? Folks back then didn't ask these questions out loud, because the answer was already understood. You kept your loved ones close, especially when evening crept across the hills. Think about the gatherings the locals had, small ones, usually around fire pits behind old cabins. The grown-ups would speak quietly, their voices low, eyes drifting toward the ridge more often than the conversation required. And if someone mentioned the old family, there was always a pause. Not fear. Not exactly. More like respect mixed with caution, the kind that came from knowing too many stories to ignore. Be honest with yourself. If you lived in that settlement and saw one of their children watching from a distance, motionless among the trees, would you pretend you didn't notice? Or would you turn away and quicken your steps, hoping whatever you glimpsed would remain where it stood? These were the kinds of thoughts that shaped the daily lives of those who lived closest to the ridge. No one had to be told twice. No one dared push beyond the boundaries the generations before them had set, because deep down they sensed the truth long before that fateful year arrived. Some families kept to themselves, but that family at the edge of the ridge, they existed differently, and by 1974, everyone knew something was coming. They just prayed they wouldn't be the ones to meet it first. Long before 1974 ever carved its mark into the valley, people had already begun whispering about how that family on the ridge changed with each passing generation. Their story didn't shift suddenly. It shifted the way mountains shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day you realize the landscape is no longer what it once was. The earliest recollections came from the elders, whose memories reached back to the early century. They remembered the first generation as quiet people, reserved but hard-working, living close to the land, the way most families did then. They rarely visited the settlements, but when they did, their presence was unremarkable. Just another mountain family, carving out a life in the thick of the forest. But as the years passed, the second generation began withdrawing more deeply into their homestead. They built additional structures across their land, though no one ever saw outsiders come to help them. Every board, every stone, every post seemed to be shaped by their own hands alone. Residents in the nearest settlement would occasionally notice the faint glow of lanterns on their ridge, long after everyone else had retired for the night. The third generation brought the first undeniable shifts, subtle at first, but enough to stir quiet unease. Those who encountered them described a way of standing that felt different, as if they were listening to something the rest of the valley couldn't hear. Their gait changed too. They walked with an odd rhythm, their steps almost gliding over the uneven forest floor. A few hunters claimed these children could cross steep slopes without slipping, even when the ground was slick with rain or autumn leaves. By the fourth generation, the whispers had grown harder to ignore. Villagers would sometimes glimpse one of the children, peering from the thick brush, unblinking, their figure still as a stump, until someone got close enough to speak. Then, without a word, the child would step backward into the woods, each movement smooth and soundless, fading from view, as if the forest swallowed them willingly. Their appearances in town became rare, and on those rare days, they did come down the ridge. They stood apart from the other families, never shivering in winter, never fidgeting, never speaking more than a few curt phrases. Their limbs were longer than expected for their age, and their shoulders seemed to slope in a way that made their silhouettes easy to recognize even from afar. People began avoiding the path near their land, especially when dusk crept across the valley. It wasn't fear that kept them away. It was the uneasy knowledge that the family's presence no longer felt entirely familiar. The fifth generation deepened that divide. Their hunting proficiency surpassed the region's most seasoned woodsmen. They moved through the forest with uncanny efficiency, returning with game no one else had seen in weeks. Locals found tracks near the creek, long impressions that suggested feet narrower than a man's, but longer than a youth's. Some believed these prints belonged to the ridge children. Others insisted no human could leave marks like that. There were nights when settlers sitting on their porches felt they were being watched. They would look toward the ridge and see faint shapes perched on high rocks, perfectly still, silhouettes outlined against the moonlit sky. The watchers didn't call out. They never approached. They simply observed, the way predators study the edges of open fields. Then came the sixth generation, the one that truly unsettled those valleys. These children were rarely glimpsed in daylight. Most reports came from travelers who passed near the ridge after sundown. They described hearing footfalls that paced them from within the trees, matching their speed, halting when they halted. Others spoke of figures standing between the trunks, bodies angled in ways that suggested a flexibility not found in ordinary mountain folk. One farmer claimed he saw two of them move together through the underbrush, so closely synchronized they seemed attached by an unseen thread. Their movements were fluid, almost rehearsed, never clumsy, never uncertain. And when he tried to call out to them, more out of instinct than desire, they disappeared behind the trees without as much as snapping a twig. Even without words, the region understood. Whatever blood ran through that family was changing into something the rest of the valley no longer recognized. This transformation did not feel sudden. It happened the way a long-forgotten path becomes overgrown. Slow, quiet, steady. Until one day, you realize no one dares walk it anymore. And as the final years before 1974 approached, families nearest to the ridge began sensing a shift in the air whenever the sun drifted behind the mountains. The homestead on the ridge remained lit at odd hours. Strange sounds carried through the valleys. The family's presence grew heavier, though no one could explain why. All anyone knew was this: each generation grew further from the valley's ways, and closer to something the mountains themselves seemed to shape. By the time 1974 arrived, the valley had settled into a cautious rhythm around the ridge. Everyone knew to avoid it after nightfall. Everyone had stories of strange sounds, glimpses of shadows, movements in the trees that didn't match any deer or bear. And then, one winter night, something happened that no one would ever forget. A single moment that the entire region remembered, whispered in hushed tones long after the snow melted. It began with a scream. Not a scream from a child lost in the woods, not a cry from the wind whipping through the hollows. This was a human voice, raw and terrified, carrying across the valley like a bell that refused to be silenced. It shattered the quiet that had held the night for months and sent people to their windows, lanterns trembling in hand, trying to pinpoint the source. The ridge, of course, was where it came from. Neighbors saw the lights in the windows of the homestead flicker wildly. Smoke curled from the chimney, thick and black against the white winter sky. A few braved the distance, hoping to see if the family needed help, but most stayed hidden, hearts pounding, knowing better than to approach. The forest seemed to respond to the scream, still and tense, as though waiting. And then the shapes appeared. Some said they saw children, though calling them that felt wrong. They moved together, almost as if the air bent around them. Their limbs extended in ways that made ordinary measurements meaningless. They darted from tree to tree, following paths no one could comprehend, always out of reach, but always watching. And in the center of the homestead, a figure stood upright, taller than any man, broader than any boy, with a presence that froze those who glimpsed it from afar. A local hunter who had been walking his dog at the edge of the forest swore he heard the sounds of running, fast, deliberate, and coordinated. When he turned to look, there was nothing there, though the snow held footprints. They weren't human. They weren't animal. He tried to follow, but the tracks led into the thick of the trees and simply vanished. That night, no doors were left unlatched. No fires went out. Families prayed until dawn, though no one spoke aloud. By morning, the homestead on the ridge seemed calm again. Smoke rose gently from the chimney. The family emerged as if nothing had happened. But the valley had changed. The memory of the scream lingered in the air, and anyone who had heard it felt a shadow of it remain on their skin, a weight they carried through the day. It was a reminder that whatever lived on that ridge had the power to move in ways the valley had never seen before. And 1974, the year when the last generation of that bloodline began, would not soon be forgotten. No one spoke directly of what had occurred that night, not to visitors, not to strangers, not even among themselves at first. But everyone knew that the balance between the ridge and the rest of the valley had shifted. The family's presence was no longer simply reclusive or strange. It had become something that unsettled even the oldest, most enduring settlers, and the events of that winter night would be the story that defined them forever. By the time the final child of the Ridge family was born, the valley had learned to tread carefully. The older generations had passed down stories in quiet voices, careful to leave out the most unsettling details, yet enough to instill respect and an edge of fear for what was growing in that homestead. The air around the ridge had changed. The trees themselves seemed to lean closer, as if listening. The midwife who attended the birth that year refused to speak of it clearly. She left the homestead before sunrise, hands trembling, eyes wide, and she never returned. Those who tried to ask her what she had seen received only a shake of the head and a long, uneasy silence. Some whispered that even the animals on the ridge fled the house that night, their cries echoing faintly through the hollows. No one went near the cabin for weeks. Even the snow and ice did not cover the footprints that appeared around the perimeter, prints that seemed to stretch and compress unnaturally, as if the ground itself had been reshaped to fit them. As the child grew, villagers began noticing subtle, impossible movements. At dusk, it could be seen near the edge of the forest, bending its body in ways that no ordinary child could manage. Its limbs seemed too long, its head tilted in angles that made it impossible to measure accurately. Yet somehow, it moved with a purpose, a clarity of motion that left those who glimpsed it both fascinated and terrified. Neighbors recounted that animals avoided the ridge entirely. Deer, which once grazed freely, vanished from its slopes. Hounds refused to track into the trees beyond the homestead. Birds fell silent when the child, or what it had become, emerged into view. A single glimpse was enough to convince people that the family's isolation had not merely hidden them, it had transformed them. There was one night when a villager saw the final child, standing on a high ledge, perfectly still, staring down at the valley, as though measuring it. Its shadow stretched long and narrow across the snow, impossible to reconcile with the body of a normal human. And when the wind carried its voice, a high, low, almost unplaceable sound, everyone within earshot stopped, frozen in the understanding that the valley itself had become witness to something far beyond ordinary comprehension. It was clear by then that the lineage had reached a conclusion. The family no longer resembled the ordinary people who had once settled that ridge. Each generation had shaped the next, until by 1974, the last child represented the culmination of decades of transformation. The elders of the valley spoke in whispers, claiming the family's final presence had shifted from human to something else entirely. Even those who had once passed it off as superstition found themselves unable to deny the truth. The final generation was unlike anything the valley had ever known, and it would leave a mark that lasted far longer than the life of the ridge itself. By the end of that year, the family's presence became more legend than reality. But the memory of what they were, the weight of that final child, would linger in every shadow of the forest, in every whisper between neighbors, in every creak of the floorboards when the wind swept cold across the hollows. The family is gone now. The homestead sits empty, slowly returning to the forest, its boards weathered, its chimneys crumbling, its walls whispering only to the wind. Yet, for those who have lived in the valleys surrounding that ridge, the story never truly ended. Even decades later, people speak of the nights when the air seems heavier, when the shadows between the trees stretch just a little too far, when the silence carries something that feels almost alive. Some claim to hear faint footsteps along the old trails, footsteps that stop the moment they pause, as if the forest itself is holding its breath. Others speak of glimpses, a figure watching from a distance, only visible for a heartbeat before it disappears into the darkness, leaving no trace. Farmers avoid the ridge at night. Travelers cross the valley quickly when the wind carries strange echoes, and children are still warned not to wander near the old homestead. And though no one truly understands what became of the last child, the elders agree on one thing: the mountains remember. They remember the bloodline that grew apart from the world, the transformations that no one could have anticipated, and the presence that lingered long after the family vanished. The valley holds the memory in every rustle of leaves, in every whisper of the pines, in the cold hush before a storm. For anyone willing to listen, the forest still tells the story. A story older than the settlements, older than the roads, and one that will endure as long as the ridges hold the weight of time. Those who hear it and recognize its meaning do not speak it aloud. But some nights, if you stand at the edge of the trail and let the darkness settle, you might catch it, the sound of something moving just beyond the trees, something human, but not quite. It is a reminder that 1974 was not merely a year in the valley's history. It was the year when the ridge became more than a place, when the predator became more than a legend, and when the mountains themselves took note of what had grown among their shadows. If you have listened closely and felt the weight of the ridge, know this: there are more stories like this, older ones, darker ones, carried in the valleys and whispered between the trees. They are not written in books, not recorded in files. They live in memory, in caution, in the quiet moments when the forest seems to watch. If you wish to hear another tale, one that lingers long after the fire dies and the wind carries the voices of the past, sit with me here in the comments. Share which part of the ridge's story stayed with you. Speak carefully, for the forest has ears, and some stories are meant to be remembered, not forgotten. And perhaps, on a night when the wind shifts just so, you will hear it too. The faint echo of 1974, when the predator of Northern Appalachia walked its land, and the mountains themselves took note.